In this video podcast, 4 of our senior unit leaders are going to discuss the operational and safety concerns that relate to doing SAR operations in areas affected by the Caldor fire. We have 2 basic objectives for tonight's training. The first is to ensure that all team members can identify added safety considerations when operating in a burn area. And second, we'll be discussing risk mitigation tactics for both the management and field teams. Now, let's start with an introduction of our panel. First up, we have Brian Nagel. Brian is the Academy Coordinator. He is a Type 2, well on his way to becoming a Type 1. He's been with the unit about 2.5 years and obviously plays a very critical role for our unit as the Academy Coordinator. Brian also has some real-world experience in responding to some major fires in the capacity of mutual aid responses to those events, and has some interesting things to bring to the discussion tonight. Next up, we have Bob Erke, who's our ground training officer for the West Slope. He's been in the unit for over 10 years. He is a Type 1, and he did a lot of the really key research that we are sharing with you tonight. Some of the things that Bob has brought back to us. Next up, we have Rita Mustasia. She is the co-ground team leader with me up at the lake. She is a Type 1 and been on the unit for 9 years. She also is a subject matter expert of sorts because she has been a wildland firefighter and is an active member of major incident response teams to wildland fires like the Caldor fire. And finally, there's myself, Ryder Evans. I've been in the unit for 9 years and serve as the ground team captain, Type 1, very active with the technical rope teams as well as the winter teams. All right, let's start the discussion. Okay, Bob, I thought we'd start with you. Now, you did some of the research and gathering some information to bring in tonight's talk, and I thought perhaps you could introduce what the BEAR team is and kind of define what they do, because a lot of the information we got came from this thing called the BEAR team.
Yeah, the BEAR team is the burn area emergency response team, if you will. They're centered out of Colorado, so they provided a lot of the resources we have tonight. And they will be working in the national forests with assessment. And Rita will be coming up later to be talking about what they've done so far. The next one is kind of a more local, if you would, because it's run by CAL FIRE, is WORT, and that's the what's the acronym? Trying to remember the acronym. You didn't have it on the slide, so. Anyways, it's emergency response team, watershed emergency response team, and that's run by CAL FIRE, and that will cover different lands of the area that's not national forest. And then, of course, there's all the local ones too. The Pacific Crest Trail does their own assessment for their trails, and it has guidance for what you should do on those trails. The TRPA, the Tahoe Rim Trail, has TRTA has their own assessment. They're going to be doing a lot of trail work, and there's another trail group in our area that's also working on it. A lot of the information came from National Weather Service, Geological Survey Service, when we talk about the effects of the fire and how it changes the whole topography of the ground. We'll talk about that later, and would lead you to more chance of mudslides, basically, and swift water type problems.
So Rita, you know all about BEAR, and in fact, you were out recently with the BEAR team and got some pictures of us. So I thought maybe we could go through some of those pictures and you could talk about these new risks that we have.
Sure.
Okay, so here is one photo you came back with. Why don't you describe kind of big picture? What is this showing you, and what are some of the things here that are a little bit scary?
Yeah, this picture I think I took just as a general overview of a burn area. It's got a little bit of everything going on here. Trees have been scorched, burned completely in some places. The the ground has been burnt pretty pretty severely, and so you're basically left with very unstable ground.
All right.
Yeah, just as an overview.
And here's another one.
Yeah, and so this picture, I wanted to portray the fact that oftentimes with the hard compaction of trail systems, they tend to not be as disturbed as some of the other areas in the forest. And so this is actually off of a popular mountain bike riding trail, Corral. Yeah, so trails are definitely a safer place to be walking. And that's just an example of that.
How about this one?
Yeah, this is not so safe to be walking. It seems pretty obvious when you're walking on the ground at this point, but these are holes that are created from root systems being burnt out during the fire, and they can actually remain pretty hot for a long period of time. And so, you know, someone could be walking along, and when they get buried by dirt and ash movement, which will happen over time, you won't even see this hole. And so you won't know it's there. You could just be walking along and step right into it. It's a tripping hazard. I don't think it'll be a burning hazard by the time we're out there potentially dealing with subjects. It takes a while for those areas to really cool off, and they can stay pretty hot, and you could step into something that's pretty hot if it happens recent after the fire.
All right. And here's another one you took.
Yeah, so one of the biggest hazards, of course, I mean, we should always be heads up for hazard trees, but after a burn, it's extreme. So these are going to be weakened by the fire. One of the pictures, the one on the left, it's actually burnt out pretty well on the bottom. It's got quite a lean to it. Those are hazards we really have to be careful for. Those trees will snap off and will start snapping pretty much now, and just breaking off and falling at any time. And winds, of course, are going to make it worse, but they could just snap it at any time.
And here's a picture. This is not from the Caldor file, but this is actually from Angora.
Right. We would hear stories. Forest Service folks would be hearing people who lived out in the Angora area during this time where they would talk about how they could just hear the trees snapping and falling all through the night. And so this just shows you what it looks like. And this looks like taken not too long after the fire happened. So a lot of the snapping of those trees and the tree fall in general is going to happen now, and then in the wintertime for sure, because that's going to contribute to how weak those trees are with the snow falling down on them. The soil's getting disturbed by the precipitation. And so it's going to just be hazardous in a big time way with those trees.
And so one of the things that I thought was interesting is, I initially had this fear of the entire tree coming down, and that was the big risk. But what this picture shows is these trees it's the top half or top third or whatever, right, that's really the problem. And go ahead.
Depends on the size of the tree, but definitely where it was scorched. But the smaller the tree is, and it gets smaller as it goes to the top, it's where it's more likely that it'll break off.
And here's a photo that Jared actually sent over, and boy, this is scary because it'd be easy to miss this. Why don't you describe what's going on here?
That's what we call in the Forest Service a widowmaker, and it happens not just in fire burned areas, of course, but areas in general. But that is basically a tree limb that is being suspended in the air, being held on by other tree limbs, and really could fall at any time, which is why it has the name widowmaker. They're extremely dangerous, and you
Scary.
want to be very careful. You have to look up constantly when you're walking around in areas like
Yeah.
this.
I could imagine that at nighttime, it could be difficult to spot something like that. So definitely something to be concerned about. So I guess to wrap things up with some of the photographs, great photographs you brought back. You brought back a few more from the Horsetail Falls kind of area, and just invite you to comment a little bit about this, kind of looking at it from a big picture of what things are going to look like out there as we start going on these missions.
Yeah, so I think looking at it more as a landscape, you're going to notice that there's a lot more green along the roads. This is where fire suppression occurred, mainly to protect the homes along the highway. And at some point too, it was even just preventing it from crossing the highway, but it did. So, but a lot of the trees along that area are more green, and this includes where the trailheads are located, like Horsetail Falls. And there's another slide of that further on. But at the landscape level, you're going to notice that the trees, there's a lot more black as you go higher up, and a lot more of the trees were burnt more severely. And so that could be a problem, because if people are looking at the trees as they approach the trailheads, they're going to think, oh yeah, this isn't very bad. And then they're going to start hiking up those trails, and it's just going to get worse as they get more into severe burn areas. And more of the trees are blackened and are going to be more hazardous. And whether or not they turn back at that point, well, that remains to be seen.
So one thing I noticed in this photo is that, maybe there could be some sort of quote highways that might be safer to travel through because the trees are in better shape. Do you think there's going to be some things like that? Or certainly we can appreciate down here in the lower part of the picture that everything's gone. So that's pretty safe relative, like you were saying, up here, up top, where there's a lot more that could come down on you.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, if I had to choose between the unstable soils and concern about maybe some of those holes that you could be falling into, definitely prefer that over an area that's got a whole bunch of burnt dead trees in the overstory. I think those, for the most part, of the areas we really have to avoid if possible, and stay in the areas that are open and where the trees basically didn't exist to begin with, or are completely gone.
Makes sense. All right, Brian, turning to you now, our unit, especially West Slope, has responded to a number of fires, after the fact to look for remains and things like that. So we have some experience of boots on the ground working in these burned out areas. What are some of the lessons from those missions in the last few years that we should highlight today?
Well, I think one thing is definitely safety is a major concern with all of it. Keep aware of your teammates. As far as distance from trees, look at the tree and add 1.5, times the tree width to keep away from it. Just keep looking up, around, be very conscious of your surroundings at all points. Widowmakers, where your team members are at. Look for holes. You're not going through an area that's been drastically changed in a lot of different ways. You might see chemicals. You'll see cars. The slide right here is, when you encounter a residence that's been burned out, and you got to keep distance away from, and it's all going to be based upon what your briefing is going to state. Are you to search the actual structure itself, or are you just basically to search the perimeter, look for any visible signs of evidence of either bone fragment or whatever it may be, animals, identify it. If you are to go into the structure itself, make sure you carry your walking stick with you. You're always probing. You will find that drywall is actually bone fragments. So be aware of all that, but just be very cautious around these structures. You've got wells that you won't see, and you may be stepping on, and these are plastic water wells, and you may be walking right through it. So just be very cautious when getting around structures now, or even in the woods. People will bury their wells out there, and all of a sudden you're falling in. There's a lot of hazards, especially in the West. We've encountered more of a kind of quasi-urban environments. I'm going to call them rural environments, where you've got homesteads and solar panels, pot farms, containers that used to maybe hold chemicals. Just be aware of what you're opening up, what you're coming in contact with. As on the left, when you're searching a structure, tap on it, with your trekking pole. Hey, is anybody in here? First of all, you don't know who's come back. One of the things we need to be aware of: has anybody come back to the facility? The ones that you're showing right here, especially with the pot farms, they want to protect their property. And if you're seeing cameras, and for instance, we came upon one in Butte County where someone just put a brand new footing in post fire. Hair went on edge real quickly, called into our LEO that, hey, we've got something here, and you extract the team out. It's not worth you getting into an environment where you can't be seen, and someone wants to protect their weed more than they care about you and or their dogs. So I think those are some of the things you just got to be really careful of. Walking the structures, there's loose gravel, there's trip hazards, there's a lot of barbed wire, because these, remember, you're one, and you can't see it because it's maybe charred or it's been degraded to a certain point in time, because you're crossing, you're given a grid segment, and you're crossing boundary lines in your grid. But hey, that may be someone's property line, and there's barbed wire, there's chicken wire. All these things are going to come into play, and got to be looking around. It's just it's a very much sense of, you got to really have a heightened awareness regarding the PPE gear. That'll be dictated by the briefing itself, what you are to wear. Mostly it's encouraged to wear cotton jeans. Make sure don't wear your hiking boots out there. Get a pair of good, I'm not gonna use the word shit kickers, but I grew up in New England, we call them shit kickers, but just a good pair of working boots, because they're gonna get muddy, they're gonna get black. A good pair of gloves. Wearing masks is definitely good to have around. And one thing is, always bring a helmet, because it protects the widowmakers. We had everybody assigned a helmet out in Butte and Grizzly Flats. Everyone wear a helmet. Wear eye protection. Even if it's normal, wear sunglasses, wear eye protection. There's a lot of dust that kicks up, debris that can get out in the area. A good pair of gloves is definitely recommended, because you're going to be grabbing stuff. There's a lot of soot, things like that. Or just, you're going to put yourself in you are now in a spot that's very hazardous on a lot of different levels.
Okay, great. Well, Rita, I want to actually jump back to you for just a second. And we've got this slide up on the screen right now that shows some rocks and things like that on a slope. And you mentioned some things about things being unstable. And I was really thinking about all the trees and things like that. But are there other things other than the trees that could get us after these fires?
Yeah, the rocks, logs on the ground are very unstable after a fire. So when you're walking around on steeper ground, rocks can start rolling down out of nowhere at any time. And so can logs. Logs might get, trapped behind another tree or something as it's rolling down. But there's a lot you have to be careful of when it comes to things like that, and being able to plan ahead and know where you're going to go in case some of those rocks do start coming down.
Yeah,
I guess I would think of it as walking in avalanche country, and how to figure out a path around some of those areas.
Yeah, I bet it's sort of like when we first get out in the springtime, there can be a lot of sometimes really substantial rocks from the freeze, thaw, freeze cycles that have been that aren't as stable as you'd expect, and you can go bouncing up these sort of class 3 rock fields and set things loose, and your teammates got to be very careful in those situations. So, the next thing, Bob, you found a video on that shows a stream coming down with some water. I thought we should take a look at that. It's pretty interesting.
So this particular video was from a fire down in Southern California, but it's the same situation where the soil actually changes and is more apt to flow. It doesn't absorb the water as well. So in this particular instance, it's only a matter of a minute and a half where there's a little stream bed, which you're out searching. You may just find a little stream bed that's completely dry with nothing in it at all, but it's a depression, and it starts to rain above you. Maybe you don't even know it's raining, and you start seeing the flow coming down there. And with your best thing that you need to do is to just get it out of the way, because within a minute or so, it's turned into rocks, mud, sticks, all kinds of debris. And if you take the swift water training, you know that you only have to get up to just above your ankle. And that stuff will knock your feet right out from underneath of you. And now you're laying down in that. Now you can see the sticks are already there, only for about a minute or so. You cannot get out of this situation at all. So you want to stay away from that, back away if you see that. If your team is big enough and you've got 5 members ahead of you and 3 members behind you, both of you go away from that stream bed.
Yeah, the threat of water is an after fact on Highway 50 and other places, causing all sorts of disruptions for us is a real concern, I think. All right, so Bob, I thought it'd be really good if you could sort of go through any other sort of safety concerns that you think arise from this new terrain we're going to be operating in.
Yeah, so the one thing you want to be considered your team, be aware of it ahead of time, like we talked about before, any kind of hazards you might think of. When you go back to the video you just saw on the debris coming down through the stream, you may be going through an area that looks like Rita was talking about, looks fairly pristine where you're at, but up above you where you can't see may be burned out and completely bare, and therefore it's a high probability of a mudslide coming down through there, through the stream bed. So if you're searching that kind of an area and it turns into an afternoon where there might be a thunderstorm or whatever, you want to be aware of those things coming down. Even if you're in a nice wooded area that's nice and green and everything, that may be coming down through your area. That's number one. Going back to the pictures you saw on the trails that are kind of well worn in the forest, those trails will be well worn. And remember, when we're searching too, that probably the signs are gone. They're all burned up. So all the trailhead signs that a lot of people depend upon, when they're looking for something, they won't be there. And then taking side trails is going to be a lot more dangerous because the fact that they're not as well worn, especially if they're going across, switchbacks, and the debris now is 6 inches thick of this dusty stuff coming across this, switchbacks. That'll be a safety concern for you to stay on the trail as much as you can. So, but basically, side trails are just more dangerous. That's probably the bottom line to it. So those are kind of the safety things, I think, besides everything else has been mentioned.
One thing I learned, it relates to the soil in the ash. It's really, as it's burned through, it's changed the nature of the soil. I was imagining that you have all this ash, it's nice and fluffy and everything. It would be, a great absorber of water, but that's not the case, is it?
No, that especially the first 4 or 5 inches of the ground underneath the actual soil below the ash has been changed, and it doesn't absorb the water in the same fashion anymore. So it's almost like having that slick layer under a snow layer, the ball bearing layer. It's sort of like that, and it'll allow the ash to wash off even faster. So it's a lot more dangerous in the rain. And when you're also, if you're going side hill, looking for something, searching, like Brian was talking about, we did some grid searches in some pretty good side hills, and you slide around a lot of this stuff. So it's a slippery type situation.
Good to know. All right, so I thought we'd just sort of start to wrap this video up with a discussion about SAR operations and some specific things we should be doing when we're working in these areas. And I'm going to call out sort of an elephant in the room, so to speak, following this fire event, and that is the real possibility of the West Slope and Tahoe team being cut off from one another, maybe for extended periods of time due to rock falls or mudslides and things like that. It certainly it's happened in the past, and it seems to me that it's even more likely to happen, this winter season. And I bring that up because I think it's really important that the West Slope team be ready for some winter missions where they would participate, but a lot of times, for example, a Sierra Tahoe type of a call, which would typically go to the Tahoe team, it could be very well be that the West Slope team is going to have to be the lead, provide the leadership on those kind of calls, because Tahoe may not be able to get there. So just some things to think about there. All right, so Bob, if you could touch on some of the things that our management team should be thinking about when they are, coordinating SAR operations in these burn areas, that'd be great.
Okay, for that, we want to really consider some of the areas that may be high probability for the subject versus high probability of danger. We need to really think about that from a no situation. And like I've talked about before, I think the weather is going to be one of the major concerns, that if we think there's any kind of a precipitation coming in, we're going to have to be careful with, deploying teams into that kind of situation if we think it's a burn area and we got weather combined with that. The other thing they need to is make sure in the briefings we cover, hopefully we'll get a lot of people through this little training, but if they don't, to cover the, all the widow makers, the trees, and all the things we talked about, the dangers of falling in the holes, all those kinds of things. Make sure that the management goes over all that in their safety briefing, but also in the, since we're using SAR topo, we can kind of look at the terrain and how steep it is. The typical, working conditions for type 2, may be a little bit limited, and we need to actually move that up to type 1 because of the slope angles, because of the ash content. It's a lot slicker and they need to be well equipped. I would say that also all the teams need to be considering the equipment they carry. It's really, really handy out there to have your trekking poles. And I know a lot of people will go out without trekking poles. So I think the management needs to lean on that on equipment side too, to make sure that we've got adequate lights, adequate trekking poles, and all those kinds of things. Footwear is real important. Most of the time, most of our teams go out and they're fully prepared, but sometimes I've seen people go a little bit, the footwear is not quite substantial, and you really need that substantial footwear on this type of terrain.
All right, thanks, Bob. Now, Rita, could you touch on some of the things from a ground team leader in the field, some things that you'll be doing when you're out there leading teams in the field?
Yeah, there's a lot to think about, and a lot more than what we would normally think about. I would start with the fact, I mentioned it earlier, if you're getting ready to go head out to get somebody, you want to choose your route carefully. And sometimes, even if it's shorter to go cross country, it might not be the best choice. And to stay on the trails, I think, as often as possible, even if it takes a little longer to get there. And that's just more for the footing purposes. In general, though, when it comes to snags overhead, to me, that's the number one factor that needs to be avoided. So if there's a way to have an idea of what you're getting into as far as the overhead, the trees above you, and staying out of that black area where there's a lot of dead trees.
What about at nighttime? We're out there at night a lot of the times.
that's going to be even more tricky. So a lot of good light source is going to definitely be helpful. So, the binder lights, Chris Binder has like a headlamp that is, brighter than I've ever seen. But
it's like
anyway,
a train light or something. Yeah.
Can see them from 10 miles away, but really good lighting, it'll help for sure. And again, it's about looking up, not just looking down, looking up, looking down, looking all around. So you want to choose your route carefully, be aware of your surroundings, and choose a good route. Stay on the trails if you can. Definitely at nighttime, light is important. And then also, as far as like winds are concerned, if the wind is blowing, be conscious of which way it is blowing and how that might impact where you're walking and the trees that you're going to be surrounded by. And honestly, if I'm walking around under dead trees, expedite. Get in, get out as soon as possible. I mean, you just got to go fast. Try to get in and out of there. Really have a very small exposure time out there. You want to minimize how long you're exposed. So I would say that is super important. If there's an actual injury of sorts where you're going to have to tend to somebody, it's not just like, hey, how you doing? You just cold here. Let's get you out of here. Someone's injured, you're going to have to spend a little more time with them in getting them out. Do so, take that time, but then you might really look to having like a safety person, someone who can just step back and watch and check out the surroundings and making sure that they can give a heads up if they see something, and give everybody a little bit of an idea if something's coming down on them.
Yeah, that seems like a good suggestion. So treat it like you would if you're on scene in a technical rescue type environment, even though you're just sitting on the ground with those trees around. You're in a technical, dangerous environment that's worthy of a safety officer if you have enough people on the team to do that. That's a great suggestion. The next thing I'm going to take, it's really has to do with our winter operations. And we know things are going to be different. Areas that we've worked in before where we had trees and even really tall shrubs to work as anchors for the snowpack, those things, they're going to be gone. I don't yet have an understanding or good appreciation of exactly what that snow ash ground interface is going to be like, but intuitively it doesn't seem like it's going to be better than before. And we're going to get some more definitive answers from some experts in that area. But just the nature of the burned ground is going to be different. And I wouldn't be surprised if the avalanche behaviors are going to be a little bit different. Keep in mind too that the temperature gradients are going to be more severe because without those trees there to prevent the snowpack prevent that radiating heat from escaping at night, we're going to have greater temperature gradients over over additional areas than before, and that of course can produce faceting in things that produce avalanches. And our terrain traps, again, without those anchors up above in different areas, there could be areas that we weren't as concerned about their possibility of being terrain traps that we need to be more alert to. And then the other thing regarding winter operations is that with all the fallen trees and debris, skiers, snowmobilers, UTVs, snowcats, anything traveling over the snow is going to have to be extra careful and maybe a little more conservative, maybe a lot more conservative about how fast we're moving so that we don't inadvertently run into all these additional obstacles that could be, just buried under an inch of snow. All right, it's time to wrap things up. First, thank you to Brian, Bob, and Rita for participating as our panel participants. And I'd also like to thank Jared, Chris Binder and Jason Calvert for supplying additional photographs that we used in the presentation that you've seen so far, as well as some additional intel that I'm going to include in this wrap-up. So the first thing is, looking at the situation from a management standpoint, we need to consider this. The presence of burn areas needs to be included in our risk assessment and should factor into our go, no-go, delay, and resource type deployment decisions. In short, there may be times when we need to go out of our way to avoid these burn areas because we just can't assess the risk. There may also be times when it's appropriate, because the person's not injured, we have good communications and moderate weather conditions, when it's totally appropriate to delay response until first thing in the morning when we have the benefit of daylight. Now, we need to mitigate our falling tree risks. And this isn't just something we need to worry about this winter. The falling tree risk can persist for several years. We also need to consider what the wind forces that helicopters may produce when working around these trees, especially if we bring in medium or heavy helicopters like Black Hawks and Huey helicopters. These helicopters can produce downward wind drafts of over 80 miles an hour and certainly have the potential for knocking something loose. So we need to think about that before using those types of resources. Now here's one of the photos we didn't show earlier at the panel. We didn't have it. This is one that Chris brought back from the strawberry area. And you can see that this tree is in a precarious position, and be very surprised if this was still in one piece by the end of the winter. Burn affected areas are hydrophobic. Now this means that the soil no longer absorbs water. And we saw in the video of what small streams can do in terms of moving lots of debris downstream very, very quickly. We also touched on the fact that it's likely that the snow ash burned ground interface may behave differently. This is something that we'll get some expert advice on, and we will integrate into our annual avalanche training. Another thing that we need to remember is the ground is unstable and it contains hidden dangers. Areas where roots have burned out have the potential to collapse and cause lower leg injuries. Boulders and rocks may also be unstable. Chris Binder also brought this picture back from the strawberry area where you see how a rock is cracked. Now imagine a smaller rock with a smaller crack that isn't completely broken off, something that will only be set off by somebody stepping over it. So consider that if you start moving through boulder or medium rock areas, that a rock may give way and has potential to fall on your teammates that are below you or cause you direct injury. And this is something we hadn't considered in the panel, but Jason brought this one back from the Grizzly Fats area, and he reported that the ground may contain puncture or impalement risks. These areas that had a lot of maybe manzanita and shrubs, they didn't completely burn, and they basically left a bunch of stakes that are sticking up and just waiting for someone to go over them. He said that ATV, UTV tires could absolutely be punctured by these sticks that are sticking up, and probably even truck tires that aren't extremely beefy off-road tires have the potential to be punctured. So remember that as you have any thought of starting to go off-road with your vehicles. And I know the tracked vehicles in the wintertime don't have air, so you might think those are good, but if those stakes essentially get wrapped up into the track system, you maybe should have some concern that that could cause damage to our equipment as well. In short, until the snowpack gets really deep, you need to be a little more cautious and conservative about how you travel through these areas. That's it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious about any of the resources that we used in putting this presentation together, they're up on the screen now. And other than that, I'll see you on the next mission.